Hey everybody, Tim Bergholz here. Welcome to our 3ds Max introduction. I'm a senior 3D artist who works in the game industry since 2008, and in this introduction tutorial I will show you all my essential tips, tricks and tools which I gathered over this time. 3ds Max is an extremely configurable program, and because of that it's also often a matter of personal preferences. Everything I show you here is based on my personal experience and what I think works best. Alright, let's get started. By default, when you start 3D Max, there's a good chance it will look something like that here. We have 4 different windows that we can use, and that enables us to, for example, create some fresh geometry here in that window and look at it here from different perspectives in the other windows. We can always toggle through these windows by pressing down the middle mouse wheel button, and then with Alt and W we can maximize that particular viewport. And Alt and W again will also get us out of there again. So let me open up the one here with a perspective on it. As you can see here, that's where we can quickly also change our views around. So I'm gonna leave it here with a perspective and talk about the movement, which, if you press down Alt and hold the middle mouse wheel button, enables us to circle around our object like that here. If you just press down the middle mouse wheel button, it will then enable us to do that here, pan around our object. And pressing Ctrl plus Alt and using the middle mouse wheel button will allow us to zoom in on one axis. So that way we can be very precise here and zoom straight into some area that we want to be doing some work on. And the other one worth mentioning is the Zoom Extends shortcut. Even though we're going to cover the shortcuts later on, I just want to combine that here with our controls in 3D Max. Let's say we zoomed out like that. If we just make a selection here for that object and press Y, it will zoom perfectly into that object here. So that is a quick way of getting back to our geometry and a shortcut that becomes very useful quite often. And let's have a look at our modifier sets. If they don't show by default, you want to click on that button and make sure it says Show Buttons there. I would recommend to put these modifiers in our modifier sets just so that you can follow better later through the tutorial. Configure modifier sets will open up the configuration mode for it, and we can just drag and drop any modifiers here onto our right side, which will then make them appear there in the modifier sets. Pressing M will bring up our material editor. You can change between the Slate material editor and the old school compact material editor. I prefer the old one, and that allows us to just bring up the material editor at any time and apply materials to our objects. As the next thing, under Customize, I'll bring up our preference settings here. And the first thing that I want to do is change our scene undo levels to somewhere around 100. That allows us to just undo 100 steps, which sometimes might be better than just 20, which is there in the default settings. So I would definitely crank that up. And as the next thing, I will go over here to our Files tab. And under the Auto Backup section here, we can then crank up our auto back files. And what exactly that is that 3D Max will automatically have a folder called AutoBack, and in that folder 3D Max saves these files all 5 minutes defined on the backup interval time below. So I'm gonna crank that up all the way to 50 so that we have 50 auto backup files, and I'm gonna leave it at 5 minutes here for the backup interval. So next I'm going to go over here to the Gamma tab, and by default it's enabled. We actually want to have it disabled, but let me show you what it does when it's enabled. it brightens up our whole viewport in ways that we actually don't want it to be. So I'm going to disable it, which will result in a more realistic way than having this overexposure and brightness. Next, I'm going to go over here to the viewport configuration under Views and Viewport Configuration. And under the Display Performance, first of all, I want to add some anti-aliasing here to our scene. Let's have it at least at 2. And I also want to crank up these viewport images here to 4K. And that will just result in 3D Max then to give us the maximum available resolution for, let's say we want to load in some reference images here that we want to use for our work, or also textures themselves. If we load in any baked normal maps and apply them to our mesh to see if everything baked properly, it will then just come up with a maximum resolution of 4K. As the next thing, I'll go over here to the unit setup, and I want to make sure that the metric settings are put to centimeters, and also here our system unit setup. Gonna confirm that. Now, as the next thing, I want to create a few random objects here under the Create tab. As you know, we can just take, let's say, the cylinder, drag it into our viewport here, and do the same thing for any other object. However, there is also another way of doing exactly that might be even quicker than always having to switch over to the Create tab. So by pressing Ctrl and right mouse button, we get that window open up here. And in there you can already see the plane, the box and the sphere. And that allows us to just drag in some more geometry here really quick. However, for reasons unknown to me, they didn't add this cylinder here into that quick selection window. So we can go over here to the Customize and Customize User Interface to be exact, and get our cylinder into that menu. So under the quads here, we want to make sure we're in the upper right box here, and then we just have to go over here to the modeling, Control and right mouse button, and under that box we can already see our customization here for that menu, and all we have to do now is take our cylinder and drag it in there. And I also want to add some text shape to it, which will then make it easier for us later to create some high poly text really quickly. So I will just add that to it and close that window here, which will automatically save it. And let me just delete everything that we have here. I want to be talking about shortcuts as the next thing. And shortcuts are, of course, a matter of personal preference and choice. Whichever actions you see essential and important enough to your workflow, you should assign a shortcut to, so that it saves us time in the long run to perform these specific actions. So what I will do here is go over my personal preferences in shortcuts. You can always go over to Customize and Customize User Interface, and this is where you can change the individual shortcut settings. So let me just create some fresh geometry here. Gonna create that teapot here. And the first thing would be the Display as See-Through toggle, which by default is on Alt and X. So pressing that will just make our object basically transparent, and we can see what's happening on the other side, which is something that we make plenty of use of. So as the next thing, I want to talk about the Convert to Editable Polygon shortcut. And what that does is that any primitive that we pull into 3D Max here requires to be converted to an editable poly in order to work with it. So there are two ways of doing that, which is right-clicking, Convert to, and Convert to Editable Poly. Or in order to make that quicker, I'm just gonna have it on a shortcut, and pressing that will then do exactly that. Next, let's have a look how we can quickly select edges on our object. Selecting it like that here and pressing Select Subobject Ring as a shortcut will give us this ring selection here. Alternatively, we can also make a horizontal selection, which is our Select Subobject Loop shortcut, and that basically just does the same thing but in a different direction. So having it set up for the loop and the ring definitely makes it easy for us to quickly select edges here on our object, and is something that we will be doing a lot through the actual modeling process. The next shortcut is the Connect Edge shortcut, and that goes hand in hand very often with our loop and ring selection. So making a ring selection here on that and pressing Connect Edge as a shortcut will then add another edge loop here in the center of that. This is a quick way of adding more edge loops to our geometry, and again something that we will be doing a lot through our actual modeling. Just gonna undo that. So the next shortcut is the Convert to Face Poly action that I want to have a look at. And what that enables us to do is that after we made another edge selection here and pressing that shortcut, it will then make a face selection along these edges and just convert it into faces on both the upper side of that edge loop and the one below. So it just looks at everything that borders to it, and that is another quick way of creating a polygon selection here for our geometry. Alternatively, you can also press Ctrl, having the edge selection active, and pressing that polygon button here will then just convert it also into that face selection, or alternatively here also in the vertex selection. So that is another way that we could perform that action. So with that selection active, we can then have a look at our Smart Scale, which by default is set to R. And we can just do exactly that, scale our object. And under the Rotate, which by default is on E, we can then just do things like that here really quickly. Change the looks of our actual geometry around real quick. And W is default for select and move, and allows us to just shift it on whatever axis we want it to shift around. Let's have a look at the Cap Poly. If I will take this object here and delete a few faces out of it, I can fill it back with geometry by going into the border selection and just pressing that shortcut. Cap Poly will then add fresh geometry onto that. And that would go often hand in hand with our Connect Vertex shortcut, which allows us to select any vertices that we want to connect with each other. So for instance, this one here on top I already have. So now I'm just going to select the one down there, and pressing our shortcut will then just add a fresh edge on that selection here. Alternatively, I can also just add a few more vertices here to it, and pressing that shortcut then will make some more edge connections at the same time here. The next shortcut is the Collapse Poly shortcut. And what exactly that allows us to do is taking anything like that here, for example in our face selection, and pressing that shortcut will then just do this here. It collapses it to one center point, and we can do the same thing for both our edge selection and for vertex selection and face selection. So it's a quick way of basically collapsing geometry or getting rid of it, and is another very useful shortcut. So let's have a look at another way of removing edges. Or let's say that's the official way here. Having an edge loop selection like that one and pressing Ctrl and Backspace will just get rid of that complete edge loop together with the vertices. So as you can see here, it will just completely get rid of it. And alternatively, we can also have an edge loop selected like that and just press backspace, which will delete those edges but leave those vertices in place. And that might be useful for some occasions where we just want to re-triangulate our geometry, but not get rid of these actual vertices that were part of the original edge loop. So something to keep in mind, and something that again is useful for later modeling. The next shortcut is the chamfer action that I want to have a look at. And I would recommend reserving a very prominent key for it. No double key shortcut, but actually one that you can quickly access. And let's see how we can actually use it. So having an edge loop selection like that and pressing the chamfer action shortcut will then open up our chamfer dialog ability, and by pressing down the mouse button we can then go ahead and adding more chamfer edge loops to our original edge loop selection. Next, let's see how we can use our attach poly action. And for that, I'm gonna make a copy by pressing Shift and dragging it here on the Y-axis. That will give us a duplicate of our original object, and I'm gonna leave it here as a copy. And now I'm going back to our original object and press our attach poly shortcut to attach it to that selection. So now it's one object where before we had two. And that goes hand in hand with the detach poly action. So I'm gonna go here into our element selection mode, selecting the copy that we just made, and pressing that shortcut then will just detach it back and makes two objects out of what before was one object. So I'm just gonna delete that, and let's have a look at align X, Y, and Z. I have it on Alt plus 1, 2, and 3. And what exactly it does is that if I press these shortcuts here, you can see how it just flattens everything on one axis. And that makes a lot of sense to have on a shortcut, probably not for the example that I use it for here, but let's see about this one here. So for example, let's say we decide we want that to be flat. I just select these verts, and now I have it all aligned on the Z axis by making use of that shortcut here. So the next shortcut that I want to have a look at is the inset shortcut. And this one works in combination here with our face selection. So let's say we have a selection such as that here on our teapot. We can then switch over here to our inset action. Pressing the shortcut will highlight it also here on the right side, and then we can just inset into that face selection here and move it around here with our move shortcut as well, which will result in a different appearance on our object and just makes it very fast for us to change the existing look of any of our objects. Definitely one worth having. Next, let's have a look at our Auto Smooth Poly shortcut, which I have on the tilde key. Let's see about this object. This one here at the moment has a whole lot of different smoothing groups assigned to it. Like this one here is 1, this one is 4, and this one is 3. And we can now go into our element mode here, and pressing the shortcut for Auto Smooth will then just make a smooth action based on this angle here, 45 degrees. So for example, if we want the whole object here to be one smoothing group, we would just crank up our Auto Smooth angle here, and pressing our shortcut again will then just make one smoothing group for the entire object. We can also individually select some faces here and press the button, and it will then just result in different smoothing groups here on our object. So it's a quick way of assigning these smoothing groups, and again, very important to have. And as the next thing, I want to be talking about the edge constraint mode. So let's say we have this edge loop here, and we want to drag it up on the Y and the X axis. there's no way for us to be exact about it if our constraints are set to none. You can see it on the right side here. If we change it over to the edge mode, it will give us this ability to actually not have it wobble around like that. So let's see how it looks like. As you can see, that just makes it follow the edges perfectly as if it's on a rail. And that's just one thing that we also will make a lot of use of. There's always the one or other occasion where we want to change our edge positioning without actually changing the silhouette of our object. And the next one might appear quite obvious. The left, right, top, back and bottom orthographic view modes are definitely worth having shortcuts for so that we can be quick in changing our actual view here in the viewport. There are a lot of occasions where we just want to be in the top mode and in the bottom mode, and having these shortcuts dedicated for that just makes it very fast to do that. Alternatively, we can also press that button here on the top, that little compass, but usually it makes more sense to just be quick with the shortcuts themselves. And let me continue with our target weld action. What it enables us to do is that once we are in our vertex mode here, we can then use target weld to take any of these verts and weld them onto any other vert that's within our range. So these ones here we can put there on the top, and this one here I can put one down. So another shortcut worth having, and we're gonna make some good use of that as well from time to time. And as the next thing, I want to be talking about our backface cull and reset X form. So let's zoom in here on that lid of our teapot, and it looks like there are faces in the inside, which in reality they are not. So right clicking that object and going over to the object properties enables us to check the backface cull. And now we actually see our object as it really is, meaning we don't have faces there in the inside, and what we saw earlier was just the back faces that shine through to the other side. Pressing Shift while having an edge selection will do this here, bring up some fresh faces out of our edge selection. So let me demonstrate a case where Reset X form comes in handy. And for that, I'm gonna take our teapot here, and I will go over here to the mirror mode and mirror it on the x-axis. Gonna drag it out here. And now I'm gonna make use of my Reset X form shortcut. Let me just show you here, we have two objects. So taking our copied object here and pressing Reset X form will reveal that the faces have actually been flipped. And that happens whenever you make a copy based on the mirror mode. Whenever you copy something into a different direction, horizontally or vertically, it will appear like that. And that's why we need to make sure we use Reset X form to spot such cases. And now we can just take that geometry here, go over into the polygon mode or the element mode, select everything, and then press the flip button. So now our geometry is basically back in order where before it wasn't, but we wouldn't have noticed it unless we made use of our Reset X form button for that. As the next thing, I want to be talking about the Align Pivot to Selection script. It has been written by one of my friends and former colleagues, Christian Rüssler, and in order to install it, we will go over to the scripting dialog, go down to New Script, File and Open, and you want to make sure you pasted the MCR file into the scripts folder here. It will come with that tutorial, so make sure you have it in there, and then it's just a matter of double clicking it or pressing Open in order to get it in here. So under Tools and Evaluate All, we now told 3D Max that we want that script to be remembered all the time. And you want to make sure that you have align pivot to selection bind to a shortcut. So just go back to customize and make sure you have a shortcut assigned to it and make sure you have it evaluated. So I'm going to close that window. And now we can make use of that script. I already have it bind to a shortcut. I have it on O. And let's have a look here how pivots are usually working on a primitive like that. So that cylinder here by default has the pivot set here at the very bottom of it. That's how that primitive basically came out, and we dragged our height information out of that, extruded that to the top, but the pivot remained there. So in order to change that, you would usually go to the hierarchy here, say affect pivot only, and change that pivot into the proper position where you want it to appear. However, that can be quite time consuming. And in order to do that a different way, we can just press O on any selection that we have here. So for example, if I press O now, it will just take the whole object here and put it right there in the center of the cylinder. But alternatively, we can also make use of, for example, here the vertex selection. Just select any of these verts here or edges, press that shortcut, and then our pivot will go right there in the center of that selection. So now here we have it right there, as you can see. And we can also use, like, let's say this vertex here. Gonna press the button on it, and there's our pivot. We can just select that whole face here and press that shortcut, and then it will be right there. So that makes it incredibly easy for us to assign a pivot position here to our geometry. So as the next thing, I want to have a quick look at the FDD modifiers as well as some of the other modifiers that we have in our selection here. So let's create a cylinder for that and make sure we have enough height segments so that we can then add that FDD2 modifier first of all, which then will give us this selection bracket here with control points. So the control points are these little guys here, and we can then switch over here and select them and, for example, do stuff like that here. And then go over here to the move tool and bring it down. So that enables us to basically reshape our geometry and make a completely new object based on these control points and how we want to shift them around. So for the case that we would be happy with that geometry here, we would then collapse it, say collapse all, and that would give us here our object with a new shape. But in that case, I'm just going to undo it and actually delete that FDD modifier back to our cylinder here. And we can then, for example, do the same here with the FDD3 modifier, but we have an extra segment of control points that we can work with. So for instance, what we can do is go over again to control points, take these, and also take the ones at the bottom, and then do the same action as before, but with that result here. And alternatively, also we could scale it here in the middle. And now we have some sort of a UFO here. And that is pretty much FDD modifier in a nutshell. We can also always take individual control points and shift them around. And that might sometimes be something that you want to do. Probably not on a weird case like that here though. So the other modifiers worth mentioning are push and shell. And for that I'm going to convert our cylinder here to an editable poly. Let's go over here to the edge selection and double click them in order to get some selection here, or alternatively we can make use of our shortcuts. And then with the push applied, we could do something like that here, for example. You could pretty much do the same thing with a scale, but sometimes you may want to have a modifier in order to leave it on top of your geometry and be able to revert it later if you're not happy with it. So in that case here, I'm going to collapse that. And now we actually have that as one solid geometry here. And I will zoom in, take that face here and just delete it. So now we have an open hole in there and we can then demonstrate what the shell is doing. And it's really as simple as the name already suggests. It adds a shell to our geometry and we can define whether we want to have it on the outside or the inside. So in such a case, we would, for example, do this here. And if we're happy with it, we would then just collapse it and have some weird geometry here that we probably don't have any use for, but who knows. So shell is one modifier that we can definitely make some use of very often. And also it's worth mentioning that down here we have a button called Straighten Corners, which will just try to make that geometry, as the name suggests, more straight and aligned to our outside geometry. So as the next thing, I want to have a look at our symmetry modifier. And for that, I'm going to create a fresh teapot here into our scene. And pay attention to how the pivot is now located at the very bottom of it. This is just the default way that 3D Max usually brings in our fresh geometry. And now if we make use of our symmetry modifier, you will get that result here basically. It looks at our pivot and it just makes a symmetry modification based on exactly that. So it always looks at our pivot. So as the next thing, I'm going to just delete that again. And I will make a vertex selection here on that front end of the teapot. I'm going to press that button so that now we have the pivot exactly in that location. And now if I apply our symmetry modifier again and flip that here on the x-axis, we get something like that. So again, that's a way for us to quickly make use of our symmetry action in combination here with the pivots that we can quickly control through our align pivot to selection script. Let me make another selection here. I'm selecting these verts, press align pivot to selection, and now you can see how we have that funky looking teapot here with just a few clicks. As the next thing, I'm gonna have a look at our detach elements or split elements script. You can get it over at ScriptSpot for free. Unfortunately, I can't add it to that tutorial because otherwise that would come with some copyright problems. Under new script, we're gonna do the same action that we did before. We're just gonna open up our script here and we will evaluate it. And then it's just a matter of going into our Customize User Interface, finding the Hacksaw Tools category, and bind a shortcut to split elements into separate objects. Gonna close that here. And you can see how this teapot element here is not only just one element, but all these different ones here are actually different elements just attached together. So pressing that script button here will then result in all these objects here splitting up into its own elements. So now we have all these pieces here as separate objects. Next, let's have a look at the Scene Explorer. We can open it up over here, toggle Scene Explorer, and in here we see all the objects that we have in our scene. And as you can see, we have all the split up pieces here as well, which we produced by making use of the Detach Elements shortcut just before. So let's make a selection here for some of these elements, and dragging them onto any of these pieces here will result in them to be linked to this particular piece. So now if I take that piece and drag it around here in the viewport, you can see that everything else is linked to it and will just follow it. So let me just unlink that. And as you can see, usually that would be what's happening. We can just drag our stuff individually around, but linking that will then result in it to go together, which might be useful for some cases later. We can also make use here of the search function, which again might be useful later when we have like a ton of different objects and you want to find something. And as a next thing, I want to talk about the chamfer modifier, which is new to 3D Max ever since version 2015. So both 15 and 16 come with that new modifier. And for people that have an older version of 3D Max, you can also make use of a third-party app, which you can buy here on that website, made by Marius Silagi. It's the only other app that will allow us to perform this kind of action that we need to have in order to produce this high poly geometry. And let's just create a fresh teapot here in order to demonstrate what chamfer modifier is able to actually do for us. So first of all, let me change that color here. Let's give it a gray. And as a next thing, I'm just gonna copy that over here. And now, in order to demonstrate better the differences between having the chamfer modifier and not, I'm gonna add the turbo smooth here on that instance. And as you can see, that just makes everything perfectly smooth, especially around our edges. And that is exactly what we don't want to have for a hard surface workshop such as this one here. So in order to not have it that smooth here around these edges and actually have it hard edged, we're gonna make use of smoothing groups in combination with our chamfer modifier. So let's go over here to the other version of the teapot. Take note how this lid is all one smoothing group here. Now, in order to break that up, I'm gonna make a face selection here. Take these edges, convert them to faces, and I give them a different smoothing group. So all these here have different smoothing groups now. Gonna make a ring selection here and also give it a smoothing group. And just go ahead and do that here on some other spots as well, like this one here. Or actually, I want that here all to be one smoothing group, so let's convert that to faces. Clear all and override it with one smoothing group. And here at the bottom, I'm gonna just select that vert and grow the selection after I converted it to faces. And also one smoothing group, and same as here at the bottom. Let's make another ring selection here, also give it some smoothing groups. Same as here. Clear all and force it to take one smoothing group here. So that looks pretty good to me. Now let me add that chamfer modifier finally. And by default it looks like that. So we have to edit these parameters a bit. From smoothing, we want to make sure we have set to unsmoothed edges. And now you can see already what's happening. It chamfers along our smoothing groups. So that allows us then to further edit these parameters if we want to, like the amount and the segments, and basically change the hardness of our crease. And in combination with the turbo smooth on top of it, we then get a perfect looking hard surface mesh here. So you can already tell the difference here from right to left. And again, we can further edit these parameters here. And that gives us the maximum control. And what makes that method also the best for our high poly workflow is that we can always go back into our editable poly mode and change our geometry because everything is based on these modifiers. So changing your high poly look has never been easier than that and makes it incredibly flexible. And as the next thing, we're gonna have a look at text tools. You can download it for free and you can just drag and drop the installer file here into the viewport, hit the quick install button, and in order for 3D Max to remember it the next time we start it, we want to make sure that we really integrate it into 3D Max. And in order to do that, we go over to Customize and Customize User Interface. And then in our category, we are having a look for text tools. And then we just drag that button here over to the left corner here. And that way we can always bring up text tools. So as you can see, there are a whole lot of different buttons here that come with text tools. And all that's important to know at the moment is that it is a support plugin that helps us with the unwrapping, at least in some parts. So some of these actions will be useful later for us. For now, all that really matters is that we have it installed. There are also some explanations on the main website of Text Tools that explain in depth what it's doing. Other than that, I will just go ahead here, create a box and demonstrate the isolation mode, which I also make frequent use of. Alt and Q is the toggle for that. And now I'm gonna add an unwrap UVW modifier here on top of this box. And we could do that by going over here to our modifier list on the right side and just confirm unwrap UVW, or we could make use of another shortcut and just quickly toggle this unwrap editor window. It also makes sense to confirm that it's always coming up here, the edit window, and save these settings as default. So that enables us to quickly jump in and out here out of the edit UVW dialog. And as the next thing, I will just jump straight back into the edit UVW to demonstrate our stitch shortcut. For that, I'm going to flatten all these faces, and now I can just select any of these edges here and stitch the other faces back on it. So that way we can later make some very fast stitching action here on our objects, and I will just show you where you can install that. Customize User Interface, and under Group you want to go over to Unwrap UVW, find the stitch and add it to any shortcut of your preference. I have it on Shift+S. And just to demonstrate it again here, that way we can very fast just stitch our things back. The other thing to be aware of is that under Tools and Stitch Selected, you want to make sure that you have the same settings here that I have. Otherwise you may get some strange results with the stitching. So then you only have to save it again, save current settings as default, and that basically then makes it perfect in order to stitch our things back together. And another very important shortcut that we're gonna make plenty of use of later when we're unwrapping. And that pretty much sums it up here for the most important actions, modifiers, and scripts that help us to be fast and efficient with our modeling process. And speaking of which, We are going to continue with the modeling part of the AKM after that chapter. So I hope to see you there.